The mountains of Transylvania were supposed to be impossible to conquer. High passes guarded by fortresses of stone, gold mines buried deep in the Carpathian ridges. And then, in the spring of 106 AD, the Emperor Trajan did something no Roman commander had ever attempted on this scale. He did not simply invade Dacia. He built a wall around it. A moving wall of roads, bridges, siege lines, and marching camps that tightened around an entire nation until the kingdom could no longer breathe. And the man on the other side of that wall was no ordinary opponent, a king named Decebalus, who had already humiliated one Roman emperor and taken tribute from a second. For nearly 40 years, the kingdom of Dacia had sat on Rome's northern frontier like an unsolved problem, too rich to ignore, too well defended to easily take. Within 6 months, among the richest independent states in Europe would cease to exist, its king dead by his own hand, its gold flowing south in wagons that took years to empty. So how did Rome swallow a whole country that 2 emperors had already failed to break? Here is what I am going to walk you through in the next 25 minutes. First, the exact terrain that made Dacia the hardest target on Rome's map, and why every previous invasion had bled out in the passes before reaching the capital. Second, the single engineering project, a bridge across the Danube more than a kilometer long that changed the entire strategic equation before a single legion crossed. Third, the reason Decebalus, one of the most gifted commanders Rome ever faced, had already beaten one emperor and forced Trajan himself to sign a treaty just 5 years earlier. Fourth, the specific tactical method Trajan used to turn the mountains from Dacia's shield into Dacia's cage, converging 7 columns on one fortress from directions no defender could cover at once. And fifth, the moment inside the capital of Sarmizegetusa when the war stopped being a battle and became a slow suffocation. The single decision that turned a defensible mountain citadel into a death trap. Stay with me, because there is one detail about how the war actually ended that most retellings get wrong, and I will come back to it near the end. I want to be clear about what I am and what I am not. I am not a historian with a chair at a university, and this is not a lecture from an authority. This is a reconstruction built from the surviving evidence, the carved spiral of Trajan's column in Rome, the fragments of the historian Cassius Dio, the archaeology of the Dacian hill forts, and the physical remains of the roads and bridges the Romans left behind. Where the record is thin, I will tell you it is thin. Where scholars disagree, I will say so. What follows is the most coherent picture the sources allow, and the picture is remarkable enough that it needs no exaggeration. To understand why Dacia was so hard to take, you have to stand where a Roman general would have stood and look north. In front of you runs the Danube, the widest river in Europe, cold and fast, and often more than a kilometer across. At the Iron Gates Gorge, where the river squeezes between the Carpathians and the Balkan Mountains, the current runs so violently that boatmen for centuries reckoned it among the most dangerous water in Europe. Beyond it, the land does not simply rise, it folds. The southern Carpathians and the Transylvanian ridges wrap around the Dacian heartland in a ring of forested mountains, cut by a handful of narrow passes. The Vulcan Pass, the Turnu Roșu on the Olt, the Bran Corridor toward the east, each of which could be held by a few hundred men against thousands. A defender at the mouth of one of these gorges did not need to win. He needed only to make the ground do the killing, to force an invading column into a file 2 or 3 men wide, where a legion of 5,000 could bring perhaps a few dozen shields to bear at the front, and everyone behind them was simply a target for rocks, arrows, and rolled timber. And behind that ring sat the prize. The Dacian core, the Orasti Mountains, held a cluster of stone fortresses built with a technique the Dacians had partly learned from Greek engineers. Walls of dressed limestone blocks laid in two parallel faces, the gap between them packed with rubble and cross timbers set into carved sockets so the whole mass could flex under the blow of a ram rather than shatter, a style so distinctive that archaeologists call it murus Dacicus, the Dacian wall. Some of these walls ran 3 to 4 meters thick. At the center of it all stood Sarmizegetusa Regia, the royal capital, ringed by artificial terraces cut into the slope, circular and rectangular sanctuaries of andesite and limestone, and a citadel perched at roughly 1,200 meters of elevation, high enough that the approach alone would exhaust a besieging army before it ever reached the gate. This was not a tribe of raiders. This was a kingdom with an economy, and the economy was gold. The mountains of Dacia held some of the richest gold and silver deposits in the ancient world, concentrated around Rochia, Montana, and worked with deep shaft mines and washing operations that separated gold from crushed ore. An output large enough to reshape the Roman economy the moment it fell into Roman hands. Decebalus, the king who had unified the fractious Dacian tribes into a single command in the decades after 85 AD, understood exactly what he was sitting on. He used the gold to hire engineers, to import iron and finished weapons, and to build the fortress network that made his kingdom a fortress in its own right. He even, according to the sources, diverted a river to bury part of his personal treasure under its bed, a hoard that Roman investigators later extracted after the war by interrogating men who had done the digging. When the Emperor Domitian sent an army north in the 80s AD, that army walked into a disaster. A Roman force under the Praetorian prefect Cornelius Fuscus pushed into the passes in 86 or 87 and was ambushed and destroyed, its commander killed, an entire legion, very probably the 5th, the Legio Fii Alaudae, effectively wiped from the army lists and its eagle standard captured. Domitian, embarrassed and distracted by wars on the Rhine and the Danube against the Marcomanni and the Iazyges, eventually made peace on terms that were humiliating for Rome. Dacia received Roman engineers, Roman military instructors, and an annual subsidy of money as the price of quiet. A superpower paying protection to a mountain kingdom, and paying it in effect to strengthen the very defenses it would later have to storm. The reason this is not just a story about one battle is that Decebalus was not an accident. He was the design. Understand him, and you understand why Trajan could not simply march up a road and win. The mechanism behind Dacia's strength, in plain terms, was this. Decebalus had turned his entire kingdom into a system where the terrain, the fortresses, and the mobile army reinforced each other so that no single Roman victory could be decisive. He built it deliberately over roughly 2 decades, and it worked because of how each piece protected the others. The passes forced any invader into narrow columns where numbers stopped mattering. The more men Rome committed, the longer and more vulnerable the file became, and the more mouths there were to feed on a track that could not support them. The stone fortresses, dozens of them scattered across the Orasti Mountains, Kostesti, Blidaru, Piatra Rochia, Banitsa, Capulna, and more, meant that even if a Roman army pushed through a pass, it faced fort after fort, each sited to command a valley or a saddle, each requiring a separate siege that bought the Dacians time and cost the Romans men and grain. And the mobile Dacian field army, armed with the falx, a long, curved, two-handed blade with the weight concentrated at the tip, capable of shearing through a wooden shield or hooking over the rim of a helmet to open a man's skull, could strike a besieging force from the rear whenever it committed to one fortress. The falx was so feared that during the Second War, Roman legionaries appear on the column with reinforcing iron bars riveted across the crowns of their helmets, a field modification made specifically to blunt its downward chop. The genius of the design was that it converted Rome's greatest strength, its enormous manpower, into a liability. A large Roman army in those mountains was a slow, hungry animal. A legion on campaign, with its auxiliaries and its train, could number 10 to 15,000 men, and every one of them needed roughly a kilogram of grain a day, plus fodder for the mules and cavalry horses. It needed roads it did not have. It needed supply lines that stretched back across the Danube. It needed water and forage in terrain that offered little of either once you left the river valleys. Every day that a legion spent besieging one hill fort was a day it burned through grain that had to be carried up mountain tracks on the backs of mules and men. And a mule eats a large share of what it carries the further it walks, so that beyond a certain distance, a pack train consumes more than it delivers. Decebalus did not need to win a great battle. He needed to make the war expensive enough and slow enough that Rome would once again decide the mountains were not worth the price. Exactly the calculation that had ended Domitian's war in a subsidy rather than a conquest. Here is the part that most casual retellings skip. Trajan had already fought Decebalus once in the First Dacian War of 101 to 102 AD, and that first war did not end in conquest. It ended in a treaty. Trajan crossed the Danube on pontoon bridges, pushed into the mountains, and fought a major battle at Tepai, the same pass where Domitian's men had earlier bled, winning it at heavy cost. The column shows a scene of Roman soldiers with bandaged wounds, and Trajan himself, according to Dio, tearing up his own clothing to make dressings when the bandages ran out. He forced Decebalus to submit, to surrender weapons and siege engines, to demolish some fortifications, to hand back Roman deserters and the engineers Domitian had given him, to give up territory, and to become, in theory, a client king bound to have the same friends and enemies as Rome. And then, the moment Roman pressure eased and the legions pulled back toward their bases, Decebalus did exactly what a man who had designed a fortress kingdom would do. He rebuilt the walls the treaty had ordered him to raise. He rearmed. He took in deserters and Roman craftsmen who could teach him the very siege engineering that had beaten him. He reached out to neighboring peoples, the Sarmatians, the Bastarnae, the Buri, for alliance against Rome, and he is said to have tried to draw in the Parthians in the east, and even to have sent men to assassinate Trajan. The first war had bent Dacia. It had not broken the system, because the system was built to be rebuilt. So when we talk about how Rome walled off an entire nation in 106 AD, we are talking about a second war, fought by an emperor who had already seen exactly how the first one failed to stick. Trajan understood something after that first war that changed everything about how he fought the second. He understood that he could not defeat Decebalus's system by winning battles inside it. Tape had been a Roman victory, and it had changed nothing that lasted a year past the treaty. He had to dismantle the system from the outside in, to make the mountains, the passes, and the fortresses stop protecting each other. Dacia's defenses worked exactly as designed, connection reinforcing connection, right up until the moment Trajan changed the terms of the design itself. The first thing Trajan changed was the river. Before the Second War, he ordered the greatest architect of the age, Apollodorus of Damascus, the same engineer who would later design Trajan's Forum and its markets in Rome, to build a permanent bridge across the Danube near the Iron Gates Gorge, at a place the Romans called Drobeta. Think about what that meant. For the whole of the First War, and for every previous invasion, every soldier, every wagon of grain, every siege timber had to cross the Danube by boat or by temporary pontoon, slow, weather-dependent, exposed to the current, and impossible to sustain through the winter when ice and flood made the river impassable. Apollodorus built a bridge on 20 enormous masonry piers, spaced roughly 35 meters apart, carrying a timber superstructure of arches and a roadway across a total length that ancient sources put at over a kilometer. Dio gives a figure of around 1,100 meters. It was the longest arch bridge in the world and would hold that record for more than 1,000 years. Apollodorus reportedly solved the problem of building foundations in a fast, deep river by diverting the flow or working within cofferdams during the low water season, sinking the piers onto the riverbed itself. With that single project, Trajan turned a seasonal crossing into a permanent artery. Now the legions could pour north year-round. Now, the supply lines that had strangled every previous invasion could flow continuously, in winter as in summer. The bridge did not fight in a single battle, and that is precisely why it mattered. It removed the constraint that had defeated Rome for 40 years. The Romans understood its significance so well that a later emperor, Hadrian, is said to have had the timber roadway removed for fear it could serve an invader coming the other way. The stone piers still broke the surface of the Danube centuries afterward. Let me put three faces on what this kind of war meant on the ground, because the mechanism only becomes real when you see it applied. Consider a Roman auxiliary soldier, not a citizen legionary, but a recruited frontier fighter, perhaps a Batavian from the lower Rhine, one of the men whose cohorts the column shows swimming rivers in full kit and fighting bareheaded with their long oval shields. In the Second War, he would have spent weeks not fighting, but building. The carvings on Trajan's column show soldiers again and again with tools, not swords, cutting timber, dressing stone, laying road surface, digging ditches, and raising the turf and timber walls of a fresh marching camp at the end of each day's advance, a fortified rectangle thrown up in hours according to a fixed plan every legionary knew by heart. This is the war Decebalus did not expect at this scale. Every road the Romans built up a valley was a permanent thing. It meant the next supply column moved faster, and the one after that faster still. And it meant that ground taken could be held and garrisoned rather than abandoned when the army moved on. For the Dacian defenders watching from the ridges, the terrible thing was not the Roman army arrayed for battle. It was the Roman road, creeping up the mountain a few hundred meters a week, turning their impassable terrain into a paved corridor down which grain and reinforcements would flow. Forever. Now consider a Dacian nobleman, one of the Terabostes, the cap-wearing aristocracy who formed the backbone of Decebalus's council and his heavy cavalry. You can pick them out on the column by the soft peaked caps that marked their rank, distinct from the bareheaded commoners, the comati. For 20 years, his world had been secure behind the stone walls of the Orasti forts. He had watched Domitian's army destroyed in the passes, and its eagle carried off as a trophy. He had seen the first war against Trajan end in a treaty his king simply ignored the moment the legions turned for home. His entire strategic understanding said that Rome would tire, that the mountains would win, that no empire would spend what it took to reach Sarmizegetusa and hold it. In the Second War, that understanding failed him piece by piece. The Romans did not tire. They did not retreat for winter because the bridge fed them through it. They came up multiple valleys at once, and the fortresses that were supposed to reinforce each other found themselves isolated, each besieged separately, while the mobile army that was meant to relieve them could not be in two valleys on the same day. The nobleman's certainty, the accumulated lesson of 2 victorious decades, was precisely the thing that blinded him to how completely the terms had changed. And consider Decebalus himself, the man who had beaten one emperor and drawn a second into a treaty. He was not a warlord who lost through recklessness or through some single catastrophic error. He was a systems builder who watched his system fail one connection at a time. When his allies among the neighboring peoples did not rise in the numbers he needed, and Roman diplomacy and Roman gold peeled away the tribes he had counted on. When the Sarmatian and Bastarnae contingents he hoped for either never came or came too late. When the bridge at Drobeta meant that cutting one Roman column no longer starved the rest, because there was always another road, another convoy, another crossing. He had built a machine designed to make war too expensive for Rome, and he was watching Rome pay the price anyway, methodically, campaign season after campaign season, without flinching, and without offering the negotiated exit he had won every time before. The most dangerous opponent is not the one with the bigger army. It is the one who has studied exactly why you won last time and has decided, coldly and in advance, to remove that reason. So here is exactly how Trajan dismantled the fortress kingdom in the order it happened. The first move was the permanent crossing. Everything downstream of it depended on it. By anchoring a stone bridge across the Danube at Drobeta, Trajan guaranteed that his army in the mountains would never be cut off from Italy and the Balkans behind it. Historians studying the logistics of the campaign point again and again to this as the decisive precondition. Before the bridge, a Roman army in Dacia was a raid, a thing that had to reach a decision quickly and get out before the river and the season closed behind it. After the bridge, it was an occupation that could be supplied indefinitely, reinforced at need, and wintered in place. Trajan committed something on the order of 12 legions or their vexallations to the Second War, perhaps 80 to 100,000 men counting auxiliaries, a force that no seasonal pontoon crossing could ever have kept fed. The lesson, if you want one, is that the most important stroke in a war is often the one that never appears in a battle account: the removal of the constraint that made victory impossible in the first place. The second move was to build the roads forward. As the legions advanced, they did not march and then camp and then march again over open ground and hope. They engineered their route, cutting roadbeds into the valley sides, and in at least one famous stretch along the Danube below the Iron Gates, they carved a gallery road into the sheer cliff face where no natural path existed, drilling holes into the rock to anchor the wooden beams of a cantilevered wooden roadway that hung out over the water. A project commemorated by the Tabula Traiana, an inscription cut into the rock above the river that survives to this day. Each fortified marching camp, each new stretch of paved or corduroyed road became a permanent gain that could not be undone by a single Dacian counterattack. The Romans built their own chain of strong points reaching into the enemy's heartland, so that every kilometer gained was a kilometer that stayed gained. The third move was the multi-column advance. Rather than send one great army up one valley where Decebalus could concentrate everything he had against a single head, Trajan pushed several columns into Dacia along different axes at once, from the west through the Banat, from the south up the river valleys, converging toward the Orasti Mountains. The sources in the archaeology of the marching camps and the roads suggest a convergence on the Dacian corps from more than one direction, so that the Dacian field army could not relieve every threatened fortress. This is the heart of it. The fortress system worked only if the mobile army could reinforce whichever fort was under attack. Attack enough of them at once, from directions the defender cannot all cover, and the system that made Dacia unconquerable becomes the thing that traps its defenders in place, each garrison pinned behind its own walls, unable to combine. Each fortress that fell isolated the next one further, until the whole interlocking network came apart into a set of doomed and separate sieges. The fourth move was to take the outer fortresses methodically, one by one, and never give them back. In the first war, gains had been reversed by the treaty. A fort taken had been a fort that might be handed back, or slighted and then quietly rebuilt. In the second war, there would be no treaty. Roman siegecraft, rams under sheds, siege towers, ballistae, and the disciplined approach, trenches, and ramps shown on the column reduced the hill forts of the Orasti region in sequence. The outworks at Costesti, the great fort of Blidaru with its double enceinte, the strong point of Piatra Rotia. Each captured fort became a Roman base for the assault on the next, a place to stockpile grain and shelter troops one valley closer to the capital. The Dacians, for all the resilience of the Murus Daciacus, could not replace 3-meter walls of dressed stone faster than Roman engineering, working now from secure forward bases, could breach or undermine them. The fifth move was to cut the capital off entirely before assaulting it. By the time the Romans reached Sarmizegetusa Regia, the surrounding fortresses that were meant to screen it and to launch relief attacks had largely fallen. The capital, for all its elevation and its rings of terraces and its sacred precinct of sanctuaries and its great circular andesite calendar sanctuary, was no longer the center of a living defensive network. It was an island, 1,200 meters up, with no army left in the field to break a siege from the outside. And this is where the war stopped being a series of battles and became a suffocation. The siege of Sarmizegetusa Regia was decided not by a breach in the wall, but by a failure of water. The archaeology of the site suggests the citadel and its dense population of defenders and refugees depended on a system of ceramic pipes and cisterns that carried and stored water on the mountain, and when the Romans located and cut that supply, the capital's fate was sealed. A fortress at 1,200 meters that cannot drink cannot hold, no matter how thick its walls or how steep its approach. Thirst does in days what a battering ram might not do in months, and it does it to everyone inside at once, warrior and priest and child alike. The defenders, according to the sources and the burn layers found in the excavations, set fire to parts of the sanctuary complex, whether to deny the sacred heart of their kingdom to Rome, or, in the collapse of order as the end came, the sources do not fully say, and the royal citadel of the Dacians fell in the summer of 106. The kingdom that 2 emperors had failed to break had been reduced not by a single hammer blow, but by a slow closing of every door at once. The river bridged, the roads driven forward, the columns converging, the forts taken one by one, the capital isolated. And finally, the water cut. Now, I promised I would come back to a detail that most retellings get wrong, and here it is. It is often said flatly that when the capital fell, Decebalus was captured and the war was over. That is not what happened. When Sarmizegetusa fell, Decebalus was not inside it. He escaped into the mountains with a body of his followers and tried to keep the resistance alive, moving through the wilderness, gathering what men he could, hoping even then to rebuild the system one more time as he had after every previous defeat, because rebuilding after defeat was the one thing he had always been able to do. What ended the war was not the fall of the capital, but a manhunt across the hills. Roman cavalry ran the king to ground in the wilderness, and one of the most extraordinary scenes on Trajan's column shows the moment a Roman cavalry officer named Tiberius Claudius Maximus, a real man whose own tombstone was later found in Greece at Philippi, carved with his account of the deed, confirming the scene in stone independently of the column, closed in on the cornered king with his horsemen. Rather than be taken alive to Rome to be dragged in a triumph and then strangled in the prison beneath the Capitol, as captured enemy kings traditionally were, Decebalus drew his own curved falx and cut his own throat. The system builder chose the one outcome his enemy could not engineer for him. Claudius Maximus reached him in his last moments. The king's severed head and right hand were carried to Trajan, who was then in a nearby town, and the head was later sent to Rome and thrown down the Gemonian stairs. Only then, with the king dead and no one left with the authority or the vision to rebuild, was the war truly over. The aftermath was total in a way few conquests ever are. Dacia did not become a client kingdom bound by a treaty that its king could ignore the following spring. It became a Roman province, Dacia Traiana, garrisoned by legions including the 13th Gemina at Apulum, colonized with settlers drawn, in the words of the sources, from across the Roman world, and mined systematically for its gold under imperial procurators, with specialist miners brought in from Dalmatia to drive the galleries. The gold and silver that had funded Decebalus's fortresses now funded Trajan's Rome. The sources describe a treasury so vast that it financed an extraordinary spending spree. Dio records a distribution to the people, and Trajan celebrated the conquest with games said to have run for more than 100 days, involving thousands of gladiators and animals, and paid for the great forum and the markets that Apollodorus built, though the specific figures the ancient writers give for the captured gold and silver, running into hundreds of thousands of Roman pounds, are almost certainly inflated by later copyists and should be treated with caution. Roman settlers moved in, and Latin spread across the province, and the language they brought took root so deeply that its descendant, Romanian, is still spoken in that land today, an island of a Romance tongue surrounded by Slavic and Hungarian neighbors. And to commemorate it all, Trajan raised a marble column in Rome, some 30 meters high, its shaft spiraling with a continuous carved frieze of over 2,000 human figures that narrate both Dacian wars from the first crossing of the Danube to the final pursuit of the king. That column is why we can reconstruct so much of a campaign fought more than 19 centuries ago. It is, in effect, the war's own documentary, a strip of images unrolling upward around the stone, carved by the victors to be read by everyone who came after. Step back and look at what actually happened, because the shape of it is the lesson. Decebalus built arguably the most sophisticated defensive system in Europe. He turned terrain into a weapon, stone into a shield, and gold into an army. He beat one emperor outright, destroyed a legion, and forced a second emperor to sign a treaty and win a battle that changed nothing. Everything he built was rational, and everything he built worked, right up until it faced a commander who refused to fight the war on the terms the system was designed for. Trajan did not outfight Decebalus in the passes. The passes were exactly where Rome had always bled. He changed the ground beneath the whole conflict. He built a permanent bridge so his army could never be starved out or frozen out. He built roads so the mountains stopped being a barrier and became a corridor. He advanced on many axes so the fortresses could no longer protect each other. And then he cut the water and let elevation and thirst do the rest. Rome did not knock Dacia's wall down. Rome built a bigger, slower, more patient wall around it, of roads and camps and supply and time, and waited. If you take one thing from the fall of Dacia, take this: the defenses that make you strongest are the ones your enemy will study hardest, and the second time they come, they will not attack your wall. They will attack the assumption your wall was built on. Decebalus assumed Rome would tire of the mountains because Rome always had. Trajan simply decided not to, and then built the infrastructure that made that decision affordable. And an entire nation among the richest independent kingdoms in Europe disappeared from the map in a single summer campaign because one man had learned exactly why his enemy had beaten him before and refused to give him the chance to do it again. Now here's the question that makes this story bigger than one campaign. What happens when the underdog is Rome? When it is a Roman army trapped in the mountains, outsupplied and outthought by a smaller enemy who has learned exactly how legions fight? Next time, we cross into the forests of Germania, to the ambush that swallowed 3 whole legions and their eagles in the mud at Teutoburg, the day the underdog wore the animal skins, and an empire learned where its limits were. If you want to see the mirror image of everything Trajan did right, that is the story to stay for. Subscribe so it reaches you when it drops.